Thank you everyone who's joined us, and I'm sure there'll be more coming in the next few minutes, but let's get started. Welcome to this, the PRCA APAC Reputation Group webinar, and thank you all for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be a very engaging conversation. My name is Kiri Sinclair, and I'm the founder and CEO of regional communications agency Sinclair. I'm also very proud to be the chair of the PRCA APAC Reputation Group. I'm speaking to you today from my hometown in Hong Kong. So the title of this webinar today is Reputation, the APAC Perspective, Navigating Reputation in Interesting Times. And these certainly are very interesting times. So this webinar follows the launch of the inaugural Reputation APAC Perspectives Report 2024, which was published in July of this year and shares the viewpoints of reputation leaders with deep, on-the-ground Asian experience in defending and building reputation for brands. If you haven't already read it, please download it from the PRCA APAC website and give it a read. It's especially useful for those of you that are working outside of the region to gain an insider's knowledge. And we also very much love to hear your feedback. So today, I'm honored to introduce our speakers, all of whom are professionals dedicated to communications, public relations, and public affairs, with long-term experience working in the region. So Bahar Jahaz, sorry, I'm going to get your names right here. Bahar Jafar, Vice President, FinTech Association of Malaysia, based in Malaysia and KL. Sabrina Azmir, Research Solutions Director at Karma, based in Singapore. Ong Hock Chuan, Managing Director of Maverick, and he is based in Indonesia. And Darren Burns, President, Asia Pacific at Golin, based in Singapore. So we're going to get us all warmed up and kick off with a quick fire round. Are we ready, my friends? Please remember to turn yourself off mute. And here we go. Question 1. How do you define reputation?
Trust.
To put it simply, it's what people think and feel towards your brand.
It's what helps people decide whether to do business with you.
Thanks. I'm going to paraphrase our founder, Al Golin, who used to say, trust isn't the only thing. Trust isn't everything, it's the only thing. So I'm going to say that reputation isn't everything, it's the only thing.
Nice. So question 2, my friends. What role does PR and communications play in reputation? What's our role?
Yeah, it's a trust builder, an amplifier, and a protector.
I'm going to quote Harold Burson here, where he says that the role of PR is to be the conscience of a company. So in this case, our role as PR and communicators is to advise our organizations on how they behave, how they act, and also what they say.
Similar with Sabrina, but a shorter phrase would be the trusted advisor.
Yeah, I think there's a great definitions. I think it's really the articulator or a translator between the organization and public. So that's really what public relations in its infancy and in its very foundation stands for.
And the last question in our quickfire round, my friends. Are there any aspects of reputation management that are unique to Asia Pacific?
A large gap in power distance in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I think it's our culture. It's so diverse in every market, but there are also some certain Asian values here that unify all of us.
I think in Asia, a lot of it is top down, whether you like it or not. So the CEO, the president becomes a key member in successful communications.
I think one thing we could think about is fragmented and very complex. And the idea that reputation in one market can be actually different in another market. So there's not one Asia Pacific reputation for a brand or an organization. They're not singular.
Well, amazing. Well, I hope that lays a foundation for our conversation today, and we'll start off that conversation. I've got a few questions to bring to our amazing speakers here today, but I encourage our participants to also write in the Q&A if you have any questions that you'd like to also pose to us. And a reminder that we do have people from throughout the region. Obviously, we couldn't get all countries covered here, but we're glad to have some diversity on our panel today. And as we were preparing for this, many members of this panel have actually worked in 2 or 3 or more markets within the region. So we're really just very honored to have you all here today. Let's dig into this conversation then and start off by asking, who do you think needs to care about your brand's reputation?
I'll jump in. I think the simple answer, Kiri, is nobody needs to care. Our job is to make them. So I think whenever we do authentic communication, we want to be relevant to our audience and stakeholders in the real world, not in the PR world. So we think about this quite a lot, getting out of the PR world and getting into the real world. Asking if we're a good citizen, if we're actually helping people or not, and being of value. So I think that's kind of really where I see it.
Yeah, I mean, on the opposite end, there are so many key stakeholders, and with a lot of the clients that we work with, there's too many stakeholders. You have your employees, your C-suite, investors, and so on. So, I mean, that being said, I like how Darren has approached it. We have to be very targeted. We have to craft for ourselves who needs to care about our brand, who our target audiences are, and understanding what they think, what they care about, the environment around them. So really crafting your target audience is essential in, asking yourself who needs to care about your brand's reputation.
But if you look at it the other way around and you kind of flip the coin, doesn't that mean everyone needs to care? From inside out, like the movie, Inside Out?
Well, who should care about your brand and who needs to care about your brand? I think it's slightly different. Who needs to care? I think because companies in Asia are structured top down, the CEO needs to care. If they don't care, then there's no emphasis on reputation, need for reputation building.
Yeah.
And I think we had this conversation during our prep call, right? About the role of communications within the C-suite, right? And whether there should be a bigger place, a bigger space for us as communicators to be part of that strategic decision-making process for the entire organization.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Ong, sorry.
I think that there is a strategic role, but also I think we need to ask the question as to whether PR people place themselves strategically to play that role.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times it's because we don't measure and demonstrate outcomes and impacts.
Yes.
A lot of times it's just demonstrating, outputs, which are vanity measures that don't do anything for reputation or the business.
Yeah, that idea of living in the PR world versus living in the real world and speaking the language of business. How is this going to help my business? How can I articulate and align with the goals of the organization and the CEO and the C-suite? Totally agree.
Yeah, and I think this is where I'm quite different from the rest of the panelists because, I'm in-house in that sense, right? And I've always ever been in-house. And in a way that kind of helps in the sense that you understand the vibe, you understand the pulse of the organization. And really as a communications professional within the organization, you're able to then articulate it to the point, you're really going to the heartbeat of the organization. And then, you call to question then the relationship between an internal comms person and the external PR agency, right? And how, that relationship between the two is so important, that there has to be an understanding and a level of trust. And sorry to keep going back to that T word, but for me, that's everything, yeah.
Okay, so moving on, what are the top elements that a brand or person should have if they're considered to have a good reputation? So we've named trust as one thing. What else?
I think consistency and trust is built on consistency, right? You have to consistently demonstrate that you are doing what you say you want to do. You are consistently communicating your values, your purpose to your target audience. And I think consistency also means being transparent, because when you do make a mistake, you have to stick to your guns and just go ahead and say, you know what, we messed up. We're sorry. And it really shows that reputation is very multi-dimensional. It's multi-stakeholder. There's so many opinions all the time. So being consistent and true to your values and your purpose will reflect on your reputation and will create that trust that you have with your audiences as well.
I think building off what Sabrina said, it's like you need to be a cat person. And what I mean by that is being consistent, authentic, and trustworthy. So kind of being that cat person. So being consistent, as you already mentioned, being authentic and genuine, and the trustworthiness kind of underlies it. So there's three elements, and that's what you look for in a person too, right? If you're thinking about an organization or a person, being a cat person.
Just building on that, I think one element which is often mistaken for a personality trait, but it's actually a skill, is likability.
Yeah.
I mean, you might have some companies that do very well, very smart people, but totally unlikable. And that does a lot of damage to their reputation as well.
Yes.
Very true.
Yeah, for me, I always think of that aspect of good reputation as also brands and people who take the action, not just say it. So, do what you say, actually out there making the action and doing more of the action than the talking about, what they're doing. And I think that, we can really see the difference of brands in those that are actually out there making a difference rather than just saying they are.
And very often, I think what makes the difference is that whether they believe and internalize, what they say they believe, that makes the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk.
Or at least if they don't believe it to be consistent, right, to the cheat sheet. So, I mean, let's be honest here, it's a little bit difficult, but I think, sometimes what's important in building reputation when you look at someone and the likability is actually the humaneness of that leader, right? Likability is something, charm is something, but being humane. And I remember an airplane crash in Indonesia and how a certain CEO of that everyone can fly airline just went down there, did not think twice, held on to people and stayed true to what he believed in and what then transpired into that organization. And at the same time, he has a lot of bad rap, a lot of good rap. But when you ask someone about what they think of the organization, whether you like it or not, it still goes back to him and his humanity.
That's right.
So living your purpose and values, very much so.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. That sort of values-driven lens.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next question. How can companies and brands strike a balance between authenticity and carefully curated messaging when it comes to building and maintaining their brand reputation?
Well, I'm sorry, but messaging can only be based on something, right? Because you can't create a message if there isn't a base. And the authenticity that builds the reputation then creates the base for the messaging. Because anything else, any other PR practitioner or communications expert will tell you it's not going to be sustainable and it will be counterproductive.
Totally agree. And this is where you separate the spin doctors from the real PR people, right? The spin doctors will try to say something that sounds good, but actually is BS. But if there's authenticity, if there's a belief and purpose in that drives the messaging, then it will sound authentic.
Yeah. I think your actions really would speak to that being authentic. I was laughing because I recalled this Air Asia crisis, I would say. I guess you could say Tony Fernandez was a little bit too authentic when he was getting his massage in the meeting room.
Well, yes.
So, I mean, you can communicate your, flexibility, your diverse workplace or whatever, but how that comes across and how your leaders, carry themselves and how they choose to act on that messaging is also really important. So it's not just about the key messages, it's how you deliver the key message, is your actions that follow the key messages that really shape that authenticity following your comms.
Yeah, and you wonder if his comms lead should have told him that it's probably not a good idea. Going back to the idea of being a conscience of the company, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of brands seem to live in a bit of a echo chamber. They have a lot of discussions internally. Go, this is going to be great. This campaign's going to be so good. They're not really part of the zeitgeist or the culture. They're not really listening, and they're not inviting outside into the brand as well. So they launch these things that seem like great to them or to their boss. To your point, Ong, the CEO loves this campaign idea. Everyone loves it, so it's done, and they throw it out into the market, and it gets a huge backlash because it's totally tone deaf. I can think of a number of campaigns in China and to a degree Singapore and Hong Kong in the last couple of years where they seem completely tone deaf. Even around AI, we hear a lot of creatives, whether they're musicians, authors, are really terrified of AI. And yet some AI companies are coming out and it's almost like they're destroying creativity, right? Which gets a lot of backlash. So that outside in, really building partnership with the community and bridging that gap is really super important, I think.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what Ong was saying earlier about how communicators and PR professionals, they are just, they do all of these campaigns. They just want to demonstrate that, okay, I've got, 100 pieces of articles, like 1 million engagement, and it's all good. But they don't actually get into the crux of what their target audience want to hear. And that goes down to getting the right data and insights to begin with before you craft your messages, before you decide that this is the campaign that I'm going to go with. This is what my target audiences care about, and this is, what they want to consume. So having that initial, insights-based research, having the right information to get you started on, crafting your messages and even being authentic is really important, because then you're understanding exactly what your stakeholders want to know from you.
Yeah, and
Correct.
I think
So-
as the world gets more and more multicultural in each of our individual cities, it's really important that we bring that messaging and ABCD test it with different people of different cultures and different backgrounds and different viewpoints to make sure that, in this diversive kind of world we live in now, that we're not offending people we don't want to be offending, that we're not putting our foot in it when we don't know any better. So, I'll have a very distinctive point of view about something, but my colleague might have a very different point of view based on their upbringing or education or family background. And I have to be able to, or we as communicators, especially in the APAC region, have to take that into account, even if my campaign is only targeting Hong Kong. If there's something in it that might be picked up differently by our friends in Shenzhen or our friends in Singapore, then we've got a problem. Right? We need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And, back to those stakeholders that are somewhat internal stakeholders, this is where agency can play a good role, or with multinational companies, making sure that you share your campaigns with other comms, your global comms office, and just say, hey, can you, check this for us and see what your instincts are saying.
Yeah, but I just wanted to add that, data is everything, obviously, right? Before, after, during, every single data point you can get, so that there's the ability to tweak the campaign, there's the ability to pull the campaign or amplify it. That's one thing. But there's also a requirement for strength of courage by the practitioners, right? In order to, go to management and look at themselves and say, this is not working out. And in a way, it's on us to look at it and say, be honest with ourselves and have that strength of conviction to carry out the campaign in the spirit of what it was planned for, right? Because things go wrong so quickly.
Yeah.
So fast.
Yeah. And I think
Music to my ears, Farah. I love that.
Yeah. We talked about that yesterday about being bold, right? Sort of you've got to, like you said, if you believe in what you're doing, you think you've targeted the right stakeholders, your stakeholders buy it. Maybe not everybody that buys it. It's maybe the right direction. It reminds me of that Colin Kaepernick ad, the Nike ad, that just did a 30th anniversary campaign in 2018. I don't know if you remember that. But when Nike launched that campaign, Colin Kaepernick was an NFL player who kneeled in support of police brutality in the US, an NFL player. And they launched this ad featuring him. It was very divisive, but it was a complete stakeholder move. It resonated very strongly with Nike's fan base. But of course, some people were turned off by it. The stock price went down, but over time it went back up again because they really articulated what a message would be for their loyal fans, and it really cut through. Whereas some people were offended by it. So it's having that understanding of your audience, I think.
Yeah, and as was said, the bravery and courage to do it in the first place and stand by your convictions, even when there's an outside chamber kind of having a conversation. We can stick to those convictions and continue to educate why we're doing it. I think that's a great example of a campaign that did well there. I want to move on to our next question and turn our lens internally. So the question is, in what ways can employee engagement programs contribute to enhancing brand reputation? And what are the potential risks and benefits of empowering employees as brand ambassadors?
I mean, if you look at employees as brand ambassadors, it's a given, right? It's simple. I mean, to me, the bigger question is how do you manage, how do you control it? Should you control it? Right? That's the bigger question, I guess. And if the answer is yes, maybe a little bit, then how do you do that without then creating backlash, which then spirals? So, it seems to me like a bit like my cat, going back to your cat, Darren, chasing its own tail. So I don't know, but to me, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Personally, as an employee or was an employee, I would prefer pure engagement and to have my employees, carry my values and be representations of my brand.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at employer of choice, and we do a lot of work around attracting talent to organizations, whether they be tech firms, whether they be financial firms, people really want to hear stories of employees. They do want to hear it, and the data shows that. So whatever we can do to harness the power of our employees in a consistent manner externally, it's going to be powerful, right? And if people are not saying good stuff about the brand, that's really concerning and a massive red flag, right? So how are we, first of all, engaging our employees, but getting to tell those stories about working in the organization?
I think there's also an extra dimension to employee engagement. In moments of crisis, who do you turn to?
Yeah.
The mainstream media is now so diminished in a lot of places that they will not give you the coverage and the care in reporting issues. Social media is just rabid, totally uncontrollable, and more likely to piss on you than to examine the facts. So who do you have telling your story out there in moments of crisis?
Yeah.
It will be employees. But again, I think the fear of backlash, as Farah said, is very real. So maybe the answer lies in educating the employees, but then giving them, the freedom to do what they want to do, but guiding them along the way.
You make a great point. I mean, we see a lot of memos these days leaked externally, right? When we smell BS, like if they're smelling BS on this incident, no matter what it is, it could be a product recall, it'd be something, they're leaking that to the press, into the social media straight away. So I think that the importance of internal communication, we say, you don't want to send something around internally, you don't want to have shared externally, right? As a memo, for example, right? So you need to be authentic and real in that discussion.
There's also that bigger, so I want to add just this bigger question about employee attraction, right? Because you've got the Gen Zs and the apparently Gen A now again, like Alpha. We've gone one full circle. I don't know. I'm past that. Apparently they're very picky about who they choose to work with or with, and they should be. So it's not just about engagement; it's about attraction and retention.
Yeah. And then also empowerment and belonging. And I think when we're having that conversation, you know, it's that sense of, are we creating workplaces where we are empowering employees to be part of and allowing them to have belonging within that work where, you know, where that's available to them. And I think that that's that, you know, when we're looking at the overall employee engagement paradigm, so to speak, there, you know, we're talking about many layers here, right? And it's keeping people happy on a daily basis. We've also got to remember that employees or people are very quick these days, not just employees, all of us, to react rather than respond. And a lot of the social media that we see is a reaction. You can really tell the difference between a react and respond. And then, so how do we deal with that when it comes to that employee? We've had situations recently in the Hong Kong, you know, Hong Kong market, but also in the mainland market, where employees have written something quickly and then been penalized for it. And is that, you know, is that the right reaction? Then people also kind of react to that aspect in a negative way. So how do we create a bonding thereafter? How do we help our employees re-engage, perhaps?
I just wanted to add on to that, Farah's earlier point as well about, you know, if we monitor, then we see something wrong, do we act on it? Like, what do we do about it? And I think that goes down to the culture that you build around your business. And I read in the report somewhere, and I love it that a lot more internal comms is being discussed now, because there was a misconception that internal communications or issues with your employees sit with HR, but it's actually very much a PR and comms issue. And the way that we treat or communicate to our employees is important. Measuring the way that they react to certain announcements, asking them how engaged they are, and even asking them how they would like to be managed in certain types of situation is important. Then that's when you decide whether you should act on, you know, a potential risk in an employee and so on. A lot of crises, they happen through whistleblowing, and I think that's purely because we don't keep track of how engaged our employees are. We don't know whether they're happy or not, and it all goes down to the data and the insights, right? Are you asking your employees if they're happy? Are you asking them how they would like to be treated or how they would like to be dealt if a certain situation arises? And that's where you build trust in and a good reputation with your employees as well. And you build these brand ambassadors that will advocate for you during times of crises.
Absolutely, that's such an important point. Thank you for those people that have joined us that are adding Q&A there. We've got a few more questions and then we're going to jump over in about 10 minutes to the Q&A. So please do continue to add those questions in there. So our next question up, as we move from kind of the DEI side to the ESG side, how important is ESG in building reputation in APAC today? You know, is it one of the top 3 critical issues today in most brands or organizations? Is it something that's more on the tomorrow list?
Oh, it's definitely today, now, front, center, right? And for the very simple reason, because financing is getting more expensive. As a business, financing gets more expensive if you're not adhering to these standards, right? And it's complex. The standards are very complex, but it's a necessity. The problem, I suspect, is that in the next couple of years or less, maybe, you're going to find a huge reputational trust deficit with the companies that have decided to go ahead, gangbusters, saying that they are going to meet this net zero transition targets and all the rest of it, and they're going to be exposed as frauds. And I think this is something that, you know, it's very important for us to understand. We need to ensure that we adhere to it, but we need to refrain, in my personal opinion anyway, refrain ourselves from making huge, massive commitments that are going to come back and bite us.
Going back to that conscience thing again, right? We don't want to be an agent of misinformation or disinformation, right, about climate or about sustainability. I think that's totally right, Farah. And, you know, in Asia, it's definitely driven market by corporates, but also by regulators, really. If you
Very
think about
much.
what's happening with EVs in China, stated targets across, whether it's Shenzhen, Shanghai, or Hong Kong, there's a lot of action in this space right now. A lot of companies need to gear up around it, need to communicate what they're doing in the space as well. And India, obviously, percentage of profits from companies in India need to go to CSR campaigns, which include sustainability and elements there as well. So it is being driven very much by regulators and governments, and we need to articulate and talk about our strategy around that, right, as communicators.
Absolutely.
And we sort of want to avoid these kind of faux campaigns that are sort of CSR-y on the side, make people feel good, but actually it makes no impact at all. Again, we're living in our world.
Yeah, and not tied to purpose.
Yeah, and I think companies need to understand whatever they're telling their marketing and comms people to go out there and spew, right? It's going to be calculable, right? It needs to be evidenced. These things get audited, and it's a huge problem if they don't really ensure that this is going to happen or disclaim it in some particular way, right? I think it's a huge potential pitfall for a lot of companies.
Yeah, to Farah's point, I think we have seen a lot of companies pledging ESG commitments, but we haven't seen them actually implementing. So the next stage after the reporting on all these pledges is, hey, what have you done to fulfill your pledge? And that's the next, I think, big issue with ESG.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of companies making action, but I think there are definitely some that are not making action, but are talking a lot, to your point, and that's very dangerous. And going back to that conscience idea again, it's important that we're not agents of that, right?
Yeah.
And
Broad.
I think we're moving a lot away from just focusing on the E in ESG. A lot of it's environmental, and the focus was on the environment, but we see consumers and even investors demanding more from organizations in terms of diversity. How many women do you have on your board?
Governance.
Is there a racial representation within the company? So there's a lot more, I would think that there's a lot more disclosures that are needed beyond just your environmental or your sustainability targets. There will be a lot more focus on diversity, inclusion, the governance, your leadership is being presented to the board and so on. And obviously, I mean, you guys already talked about, the risk of greenwashing, pinkwashing. It's real, and our job as communicators, what's difficult about ESG is you've done something, but you don't want to shout too much about it. If not, people would think that, you're just doing it for as the young people would say, for the clout. So yeah, that's I think the difficult part about managing ESG really is how do you communicate it without sounding like, you're just doing it because you have to, and that you're doing it with authenticity and purpose.
And also we talked a little bit about yesterday about how do we make communication around ESG or sustainability environment more fun and engaging, right? A lot of the work we do is these very detailed reports, which people do because it's a regulation that they have to do, but they don't really articulate very well in consumer terms or people that can engage around the content. So how do we make the content more interesting for those audiences, right?
Well, I think that's the next challenge. Sorry, continue.
Sorry, I think the sense of purpose is what drives it as well. Sabrina's point about how most companies focus on the E in ESG is because environment is such a low-hanging fruit for people. You want to do ESG, adopt an elephant, save an orangutan. That's it. That's your ESG commitment. And you can get some publicity for that. And that's where a lot of guys, don't really do ESG. They just do a lot of greenwashing.
Yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up on that ESG and moving on to our last question before we go to the Q&A here, I'd like to ask you all, what do you see as the biggest risks to reputation for brands in APAC right now?
I guess a lot of people have said this already, but because it's such a big threat, is mis and disinformation. We saw it recently in the Olympics where, one tweet from J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, and everybody thinks that a woman is not a woman, right? So that could have potentially really affected the IOC. I thought the way that they responded to that was they did really well. They quickly got onto a panel, talked about it, and said, she's a female fighter, has fought as a female fighter. And they didn't choose to tackle the whole issue around trans women in sports. So I think that was a really good way that they responded. But you can see how quickly it went, one tweet, and it just blew up. And I saw on my timeline, everybody received the fake news and they believed it. So that was such a real moment, I think, of the threat of mis and disinformation. And that's something that is really such a big risk for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice call there.
I think for me personally, being in the digital space, the speed, and it's not necessarily in APAC, it's everywhere. I think, the speed, as Sabrina was talking about, right? We don't go into the chromosome count and all the rest of it, right? So, but it's the speed. It's the speed, and as humans, we need to digest. I think it's really tough to balance as a communicator the need to digest, have a position that you believe in so that you can be authentic in your communication, and address the need for speed at the same time. It's getting almost too challenging. And you add to that, so that's global in my mind, right? Everywhere, anywhere. But you add to that what I mentioned earlier about power distance in Asia, the inability to have sometimes a very honest, challenging discussion with management and the board to say, I'm sorry, you guys are wrong. This is not the pulse. Trust me. This is wrong, right? The ability to do that in Asia is somewhat limited, and I'm being kind here, somewhat limited compared to, globally, I suspect, at least in more mature markets and more open Western markets. So it's a two-pronged problem. One is global. The other one is, with the power distance, more Asian-centric.
I would add to Farah's point on speed, is that we live in a very polarized world. So that, whatever you do, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So I think in an environment like this, again, it goes down to, what are your basic beliefs? What's your purpose? And those can serve as a guiding light. Otherwise, what you're trying to do is to move from one to the other without true convictions, and that's what I think Miller Beer, that's a problem that they have. So unless you have a mooring in something solid, you try to squirm your way around.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. I love that idea. There's also seasonal risk at the moment we're seeing in the region, which is very much in Greater China, in particular geopolitical risk, which has been a boon on all of our businesses, I'm sure. But there has been some areas of opportunity for us as well. So we seem to be doing more work around insights, tracking, strategy, and comms training in China at the moment as we deal with these kind of seasonal risk. I hope it's a seasonal risk, the geopolitics, and that we all hope it goes away pretty soon and gets a bit better. But it's definitely weighing down on us now for sure. I think the other thing is that just talking about what Sabrina mentioned before about misinformation and disinformation, there's been a lot of progress in some markets in the region. You might know that Taipei has a Minister of Digital Affairs, and that person actually focuses on this kind of thing: disinformation, misinformation, education, that kind of stuff, trying to get it out in the public domain, because we know it's a really big issue, not just globally, but in specific markets in Asia. It's really difficult, and it kills people. Bad information has been shown to kill people in different markets. It damages brands hugely. So whatever we can do in that area to be agents of change, agents of truth, I think that serves us very well.
That's very interesting, Darren. Do you know that in Malaysia there are calls to license social media platforms now? And there's huge uproar with regards to what are we doing here, right? So I think there is a lot to be said about digitalization, the need to be authentic, and at the same time, the need to respond in a particular, within a particular time, but not have it in a necessarily controlled manner, because that's almost counterproductive. It's tough, huh?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's like AI, right? At the same time, we're embracing it as much as we can. On the other hand, there's a lot of pushback around AI, right? Just because we can do something, should we do it? So deep fakes, bringing people back to do all those kind of things, right? Is it what we should be doing? I think we have to ask ourselves as the conscience of the company, are these the right things to be doing? Yes, we can do it with technology, but is it right?
And no one's mentioned the economy either in this conversation, but I think in APAC at the moment, one of the biggest risks to reputation is the economy and how corporations react to the current economic situation in regards to their stakeholders, to their employees, to the stock market and so forth. I think that's another one we should to add to that list. So talking about risk, and this is often when people talk about reputation, they want to address the idea of risk. We've mentioned then economy, geopolitics, misinformation and disinformation, speed, polarization. And I think within all of that, yes, these can all be applied globally, but I think what I'm hearing from you is that in APAC, they're very, they play out in a very different way. And it takes that knowledge of culture, that knowledge of on the ground thinking to really be able to address those risks. So thank you for that. I'm now going to turn over to some of the Q&A that's been submitted here. And thank you to those that have submitted. I'm going to try and read these without squinting too much, so bear with me. So the first question here, what is the panel's opinion about the role and actual influence of boards of directors on their corporate governance, and their corporate governance regarding the reputation of corporations? So what role do boards of directors play in reputation?
As a member of a couple of boards, I can tell you everything. Everything, because you walk the talk, and that's the most important thing. You're the face of the organization. Your reputation is part of the organization's reputation. And in some instances, you're selected to be on the board because of your reputation.
Yes.
So it's a given.
Yeah. You almost acquired reputation, right? By having well-known people with good reputation on the board of directors, right? For sure.
Yes.
And those people are very visible and well-known.
Yeah, I think a good board would be appointed from people that have line of sight on different aspects of the society. And they should bring this in, and in a way, and realize that if you use communication strategically, it not only helps you avoid crisis, it helps you run a better company, and it could actually find better ways of doing business.
Yeah, and I think, maybe that question was asked because there might be differing opinions between let's say your consumers and your board, right? So then what should you do next in that case is, provide the data, tell them that this is what the consumers are saying, this is what the people who are buying our product or the people who are using our services are saying, and this is how we should change. And then that's where you work with your key stakeholders, your board members, to try and change the reputation of how you might want to communicate. So I think board members' opinions are obviously very important. They keep the organization running, but listening to your other stakeholders, your consumers, and providing the right insights to your board to change their opinion might just be as important. So it's good to not have their opinion as the be all and end all. It's not everything. It's important, but it's not everything. Yeah.
Yeah, my experience of boards in Asia over, let's say, the last 20 years is that it used to be that boards were much more financially focused or operationally focused, whereas boards now play a bit more of a role in the marketing and external comms of the organization. And in that role, what we're seeing, and I hope to see much more of, is the diversity of boards. So not just the diversity of you know, a board being all accountants and finance people. You know, you need diversity of thinking. But also, for example, legally in Hong Kong, boards will soon be required to have at least one female member of the board. So it's regulatory diversity coming in. I'd also love to see ethnic diversity. And I think another layer of that is the boards that I participate on are very careful to onboard a new person to the board through education, making sure that they understand purpose, that they understand who the audiences are, who the stakeholders are, and so forth, and aren't just looking at the financial package and so forth, but are looking at bringing the board on as somewhat a mirror to the organization. And I think that the more we can create boards, and remember that boards need to reflect the organization as a whole, the better boards will be at directing like the organization's communications in the future. Okay, moving on to the next question from Anonymous here. How would you manage your boss or client who tend to request more communications, more emails, more campaigns with stakeholders, while it is obvious that more messages and action doesn't equal more impact, which can also be annoying to audiences and may have an adverse effect?
I love this question.
I love it too. I absolutely love it. Kick us off.
Right. I think the key is in measurement. How do you measure communication success? I think the PR industry has been guilty of measuring outputs, which basically means that, you know, the more media clips you have, the more reach you have, then you're more successful, which is totally wrong. As the questioner rightly puts, it doesn't affect the impact to the business. So we should start to move away, all communicators should start to move away from output measures, which AMAC calls vanity measures, and move to outcomes and impact. So outcomes depends on what's your objective. Are you trying to raise awareness? Are you trying to change behavior? Are you trying to change perception? If that's your objective, then your outcomes should be measured against that. If you manage any of this, your outcomes are good. And impacts is when you can actually have an impact on how the business is run or how business is carried out. And if we can shift this away from outputs to impacts and outcomes, then bosses will be less prone to ask for stupid things.
Yeah, you can't argue with data. But I mean, I would actually love it if a client of one of my bosses asked for this. It'd be awesome. More campaigns, more stakeholder engagement sounds great. And they don't want to, they just want to do more stuff. Sounds like great to me. But seriously, I think it's the ROI question. I think it's showing the boss that what's the impact of this email or this campaign? What has it actually done? Nothing. It'd be better to do this, right? Based on a data-driven conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to the difficulty in sometimes measuring the value of communication. It's intangible, right? You're building brand loyalty, you're building brand awareness. It's not one email, one sale. So as Ong mentioned, it's really about coming up with what outcomes do you want to measure that link back to your business objectives. And sometimes just asking the client, what is your objective of sending out more emails? What are you trying to achieve? And then measuring it from there will be very important as well. Sometimes they're like, oh, you know, we just want to make sure that they've received what we sent. But that's not a measure of impact. So I think just understanding and shifting away from those output metrics, determining what outcomes you want to measure, and then linking them back to your business objectives is really important. And having solid objectives is really important as well.
I completely agree vis-a-vis data. Data is everything. Data is the new oil, all the rest of it. But fundamentally, the question then becomes, how do you get your client or your boss to trust you with that data? You know, you can go and say, look, the data shows this, and so we should not be sending an email. But if he doesn't trust you, so then the onus is on us as practitioners, right? To look at our relationship with our stakeholders then. Create, again, sorry, that T word, trust. And then the data will move more swiftly. There will be buy-in. And from there, everything will cascade down properly. So I think some of it has to be, yes, data driven, all the rest of it, I agree. But we have to look at ourselves and think about how we can inculcate more trust in our relationships with our own stakeholders as communicators, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, agreed.
I think that I read this a little bit differently, and I see that brands that don't have strong long-term strategies towards reputation building tend to kind of, fire their guns a lot all over the place, rather than, they're looking at these short-term strategies. I want to attain this. I want to sell this package. I want to do that. And you see them doing lots of kind of quick fire actions, let's say, that seem to be sporadic all over the place, but you don't know what part of their purpose and value chain it is. And I think that happens during an economic downturn when brand leaders get scared, when the environment shifts so much, the external environment shifts so much, you don't know where you're playing anymore. But I feel, and I hope to see more, and I'm working with many clients on this idea that in our new post-COVID world, let's go back to building long-term reputation strategies and building campaigns that have action upon action rather than lots of different misfired actions. I think that's the way that I would approach this one.
I think, Kerry, that's so true. And I think that's happening in marketing as well at the moment. In the last few years, brand marketing and brand campaigns sort of went by the wayside in favor of performance marketing. Now people are finding that this sort of short hit performance marketing is really damaging the brand. I mean, a famous example is Airbnb, where they spend almost everything on PR, right? They hardly spend anything on advertising, right? So it's this return to building brand, building trust versus doing short-term hits, which actually might have a short-term effect, but long-term the brand crumbles because there's no values, vision.
Yeah, we don't know what the brand stands for anymore because they've done all these odd things, and they've done it on odd platforms or whatnot. So I do think that there's room, especially in APAC, that experienced COVID for longer, especially me sitting here in Hong Kong and our friends up in China, that idea of changing that mindset towards let's get back to long-term planning and thinking to rebuild brand, because brand and reputation is not a short-term thing, right? So I thank you for that question, Anonymous. We have another question from Anonymous here. I noticed that today's panelists represent various regions across APAC. Do you think the perception and measurement of reputation differ across these geographic areas? Fabulous question. Who would like to address this one?
Okay, I think the measurement of reputation, measurement of reputation and perception, again, it is how communicators measure success. Again, if they measure it properly, then you could. But then in Asia, very few people actually do it right. I know that in Indonesia, we spent the past 6 years trying to introduce Amex Barcelona's principles to players, and now we're getting somewhere. In other countries, people have not heard about this. And so they continue trying to measure via outputs. So different markets have got different measurements.
Yeah, I think for Karma, we have a way to measure reputation. We have a specific methodology that we apply to all our clients, and it's global. So it doesn't really differ. The approach doesn't differ to each market. Where it differs is in the pillars. So we have 7 key pillars that we measure for our clients. Things like your products and services, your conduct, sustainability, and so on. And that's where you see the difference. Some markets, their target audience or their stakeholders might put a bit more emphasis on performance as a key pillar of reputation. Some of them might say, okay, for this particular industry, in this particular market, sustainability is the most important pillar. So before we embark on our reputation measurement with any client, we will do a quick survey with all of their key stakeholders to say which of these pillars are more important. So the approach is the same, the methodology is similar across, but the importance in each of the reputational pillars is where it differs across each market.
Thank you. I think that's a brilliant answer. And so I think overall that answers another one of the questions that was also on here about reputation, that it doesn't matter the channel and so forth. We can benchmark reputation, country next to country using AMEC and other sources to be able to see the value of reputation in each culture and in each market within the region in APAC. We do have a few more questions here, but only 4 minutes left. So I would like to say a huge thank you to everyone who asked the questions, and actually go back to our panelists for a last question from me, if you don't mind. And that is to ask each one of you, you've seen some of these questions up here that are asking specifically about, the board. We have one here about employee engagement and, how employees publish on anonymous platforms like Glassdoor and so forth. And another question around employees here regarding transparency and authenticity. And then their communications team not allowing posts to go ahead. These are fabulous questions, and I think bring that into mind when you're answering this last one. So my last question to you before we do wrap up today is I would like each of you to share one call to action for our audience on how they can be better communicators for reputation on behalf of the brands that they're working for. What do you think, either individuals or as a profession, we can do better to manage reputation in APAC?
For me, I think that it's important to ensure that reputation ownership belongs to all. Reputation building, management, and maintenance, most importantly for me anyway, is a massive, massive task. And it has to be a collective endeavor.
I'll speak to, I guess, the measurement approach. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, as cliche as it is. Benchmark your reputation, right? Know what your key stakeholders care about. And that includes your internal communication efforts as well. So what do your employees care about? Benchmark it so you know how robust it is, how strong it is, and then you can grow and evolve from there.
I think I would address Farah's point about the power divide between the top guys and the communications people. It is a very real problem, especially if you are working in the industry. And a lot of them find it difficult to be trusted by the C-suite. What do you do in a situation like that? Well, I would think that you just need to get very skilled. You need to familiarize yourself with the latest in measurement. You need to familiarize yourself with whatever else is happening and be articulate about it so that your persuasive powers are more. And sad to say, some communicators aren't that persuasive, right? So if you're not that persuasive, then you don't persuade your C-suite, it's on you. But if you are, and you are really skilled, then if you try and they don't listen, hey, you've got choices. You can go elsewhere because you have that skill.
Yeah, I think that's great on. I would build off that a little bit. So kind of, without speaking through the lens of business, without understanding how to articulate to a C-suite or leadership, right? You won't have a seat at the table. I can guarantee it. You'll be waiting out somewhere in the crowded waiting room. You'll be one of those hundreds of people out there in the waiting room, waiting to get into the C-suite, bustling in there. So I think it's on us to articulate and better understand the language of business so we can be convincing to boards, to leadership. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is being high tech, but also high touch. I think we want to embrace technology, be progressive as we can, but we also want to be that humane conscience of the company. So those two things at the same time, embracing technology, but also bringing that touch, that conscience, that humanity to organizations. I think those two areas are kind of thing I'd like to sign off on.
And can I just say one last thing? Sometimes as communicators, we forget the number one rule, right? Which is we need to speak to the lowest common denominator, right? And then suddenly everyone's on the same page and everyone understands everyone. And I think fundamentally, you know, if you go back to that core, it's very hard to go wrong.
Speaking of the real world, not the PR world. But I want to thank Kiri, because Kiri pulled that whole report together. We should thank Kiri for organizing today's panel.
Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to ask to finish on one thought on my call to action, which is the one that people who know me will hear often, is that as you know, in roles of PR and as you grow in your organization, you become a person of power. We sit with the microphone. We are, as Darren and others have said, the conscious of our organization. And my call to each individual in the PR industry is to know your own personal ethical boundaries. Do not do what you know in your heart is wrong, no matter what client or what person is telling you to do it. And I think that in difficult times, it's sometimes harder to judge, but all of us have that feeling of, ooh, icky, this isn't quite right. And if you have that feeling at all, ask someone else, ask a colleague, ask your parents, ask your children. This doesn't feel right, is it? Because you don't want to be the person who did that thing that is then looked at the wrong way, so to speak. And so that's my call to action for each individual. I know I see it often, but I'll keep saying it again because it's hard to come back to. I would like to thank so much the speakers who have joined us today. Firstly, most of you for contributing to the report, which was a passion project, but very much done by a committee of amazing people from many organizations, all of which are named on the PRC APAC website. And also, if you haven't, and you can see Rebecca here sharing, if you haven't yet already downloaded the report, please do. There are some amazing thoughts, all viewpoints from individuals from different perspectives, and you can really learn a lot from that. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of week. To our speakers, to our audience, we're really glad you were here today.
Thank you, guys.